Picture a specific morning in March 1991, right after the dust settled on the Gulf War. The Kuwaiti government took out this massive, full-page ad in American newspapers to thank the coalition forces that had liberated them. It was a roll call of heroes. But as Japanese officials scanned that list, and you have to remember, they had just signed a check for nearly $13 billion to support that very war, they found something shocking. They weren't there. Japan was completely omitted from the list. The world didn't see them as a partner. It saw them as, well, a deeply awkward ATM. They were mocked with this label, checkbook diplomacy. And that single moment of humiliation, you could argue, did more to dismantle Japan's pacifism than any missile threat ever could. It planted this seed of resentment in the political elite, a belief that being a peaceful merchant was just no longer enough to command respect. Now, fast forward to today, and the contrast is just jarring. If you look at the quiet shores of Yonaguni Island, Japan's westernmost point, it's not just a fishing outpost anymore. It is being transformed into a military fortress, with missile batteries now staring directly across the 110 kilometers of water toward Taiwan. The country that once constitutionally renounced the right to war is now explicitly preparing to fight alongside the United States in a potential conflict over the Taiwan Strait. So how did we get here? How do you get from a humiliated donor left off with thank you note to a nation deploying offensive weaponry and effectively rewriting its own constitution to allow for collective self-defense? The story isn't just about external pressure from the U.S., it's a calculated decades-long erosion of the peace constitution from within. Okay, let's unpack this. We're tracing a path from diplomatic humiliation 3 decades ago to a nation that is, for all intents and purposes, preparing for a regional conflict. And what's clear is that this transformation wasn't just a sudden reaction. It was a strategic, internal, decades-long erosion of the core principles of Japan's post-war identity, particularly Article 9 of the Peace Constitution.
What's absolutely fascinating here is that the erosion was systematic. I mean, it wasn't just driven by simple policy changes. It was driven by a really sophisticated political rhetoric and a calculated reshaping of the entire national narrative. And we can analyze this through the lens of something called depoliticization. This whole political project hinged on making fundamental ideological changes seem like they were non-political, just necessary technical adjustments to external forces. So our mission today is to really understand the legal, the rhetorical, and the ideological blueprint that allowed the political establishment to systematically deconstruct Japan's post-war identity without triggering mass political opposition. We really need to look closely at the language, the framing that was used to justify these seismic shifts in both security and economics.
That concept, depoliticization, it sounds deeply paradoxical, doesn't it? Especially when we're talking about Article 9, which is arguably the most political and foundational issue in modern Japan. I mean, if the goal was fundamental security reform, why not just push for a direct constitutional amendment? Wouldn't that be the more democratic path?
And that is the core question, right? It reveals the brilliance of the strategy. A direct constitutional amendment is a hugely political act. It requires a 2/3 majority in both houses of the Diet and then a national public referendum. And given the deeply ingrained pacifist sentiment in post-war Japan, any attempt at an outright amendment would have triggered massive polarizing political conflict. It likely would have failed, just like similar attempts failed in the past.
So this was a workaround.
Exactly. Discursive depoliticization, that's the term for it. It emerged as the preferred governing strategy. It's a mechanism to consciously shift responsibility for these politically divisive issues, like changing the military's role away from the democratic sphere. The goal is to make these profound policy changes seem inevitable, or purely technical, or just an urgent, non-negotiable response to forces outside of anyone's control. By framing the issue as a technical necessity rather than an ideological choice, you just short-circuit the entire political debate.
So who is this external force they're bowing to if it's not the voters? What makes these changes seem so inevitable?
Well, the primary force that's invoked is the neoliberal account of globalization. The Abe administration relied heavily on this framework. The argument, to simplify it, is that Japan lives in a globalized, economically interdependent world. A world where geopolitical stability directly impacts your trade, your supply chains, your prosperity. So this involves promoting market liberalization and emphasizing economic growth, what analysts call economism, as the primary non-negotiable national goal.
That makes incredible sense. If you define the national mission purely in economic terms, survival and growth, then anything that secures that mission becomes justified. The military becomes, in a way, an economic shield.
Precisely. If economic stability is paramount, then anything that secures it, including military expansion to protect distant trade routes, becomes just a technical necessity. It's not an ideological shift that's up for debate. For example, linking the need to secure the Strait of Hormuz, which is where Japan gets most of its oil, to the need for collective self-defense, or CSD. This reframes military capability as just essential economic infrastructure protection.
And the opposition is trapped.
Completely trapped. If they oppose the security legislation, they're framed as failing to acknowledge economic reality, as risking the nation's supply chains, and therefore jeopardizing the financial well-being of every single citizen. And this is achieved through the power of framing.
Tell us more about that specific rhetorical framing. I mean, how do you convince people that opposing a military buildup is simply a matter of having a bad attitude?
Abe meticulously used figurative language and frames to persuade the public. When issues are framed, specific points get emphasized while others are just overlooked. It manipulates how political issues are understood and remembered. One of the most sophisticated examples of this involves using metaphors that compare political opposition to reform as being of the temperament, or kibuniyoru, rather than a legitimate, reasoned political argument.
It's a bad temperament.
Yes. Abe actually drew upon a famous quote from the French philosopher Alain, who said, "Pessimism comes from the temperament, optimism from the will." Abe applied this philosophical distinction directly to security policy. He associated the traditional pacifism, the resistance to changing Article 9, with temperament. He framed it as a psychological failure, a weakness of attitude, or sort of an introverted worldview that fails to grasp global realities.
So if I criticize collective self-defense, I'm not engaging in a political debate. I'm just being a pessimist who lacks the national will to protect Japan. That instantly delegitimizes criticism. Was this strategy visible in specific policy debates?
Oh, absolutely. When debating the security bills in the Diet, Abe and his allies often just bypassed detailed policy critiques. Instead, they focused on painting their opponents as holding on to these outdated, introverted ideologies from the 20th century. For instance, when they were asked about the risks of involving Japan in foreign wars, the reply often centered on the lack of will demonstrated by Japan's inaction in the face of shared threats. It suggested that failure to act proactively wasn't a moral stance, but an irresponsible failure of leadership.
So the goal is to manufacture consensus by basically eliminating the rational grounds for dissent. You make the policy shift seem mandatory for survival.
That's the crux of it. By linking policy changes, whether it's constitutional reinterpretation or economic restructuring, to this imperative of responding to global economic pressure or an external security reality, opposition becomes framed as self-defeating. It's irrational introversion. Opponents are just failing to acknowledge the changing world.
But this strategy wouldn't work, even with powerful rhetoric, unless the government structure itself allowed the prime minister to dominate the narrative and bypass the sort of consensus-building process we associate with Japanese politics.
You've hit on a critical point: the centralization of power. Post-Cold War changes, specifically the 1994 electoral reform and the later cabinet reforms initiated by PM Koizumi, dramatically strengthened the executive authority of the cabinet. Before these reforms, the prime minister was often seen as just a temporary coordinator among powerful factions in the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP.
Right.
After the reforms, power centralized around the prime minister's office. This made effective political communication through personality earning this reputation of a lone wolf who acts decisively, far more impactful than the old system. Abe utilizes centralization perfectly. He surrounded himself with loyalists and advisory panels, ensuring that the necessary reinterpretation could be pushed through the cabinet without the messiness of a full parliamentary debate or constitutional amendment. This administrative fiat was the technical mechanism of depoliticization.
Okay, let's zoom out and look at the deep historical context here. This wasn't just a reaction to that checkbook diplomacy moment in 1991. It feels rooted in decades of frustration. We know Abe was the grandson of Nobusuke Kishi. How did this lineage influence his mission? Was this constitutional revision a kind of generational mandate to finish his grandfather's work?
The familial link is not just biographical trivia. It is absolutely foundational to understanding Abe's mission. It provided both a historical blueprint and a powerful generational motivation. Abe's maternal grandfather, Nobusuke Kishi, was a deeply polarizing figure. He began his career in the wartime Tuchi government and was briefly imprisoned as a class of war criminal suspect after World War II, though he was never indicted. After his release, he re-entered politics with a singular goal: restoring Japan's sovereign dignity and revising the constitution.
And Kishi failed in that goal, but not without a massive amount of conflict, right?
That's crucial. Kishi was a hawkish nationalist who desperately sought to reserve his Article 9. He couldn't achieve constitutional change, but he did succeed in controversially revising the foundational U.S.-Japan Security Treaty in 1960. And the process was a democratic catastrophe. It was pushed through the Diet with police intervention and led to mass protests in Tokyo involving hundreds of thousands of people, the largest demonstrations in post-war Japanese history. Kishi resigned shortly after, humiliated by the popular opposition he'd provoked.
I see.
So Abe's career goal of constitutional change, or crucially, reinterpretation, was often highlighted in the Japanese media as being analogous to Kishi's career goals. It suggested a continuation of his legacy. Abe was effectively trying to achieve the security sovereignty his grandfather failed to secure, but this time he was determined to avoid the political chaos that Kishi unleashed. And that explains why Abe chose the path of depoliticization and administrative reinterpretation. He learned from Kishi's failure to secure popular consensus for an outright amendment.
Beyond the family ties and the history, what were the ideological groups that were underpinning Abe's political project? And if those groups hold views that many people, both in Japan and in allied nations, might find extreme like historical revisionism, how did Abe manage that influence without alienating the broader public?
This is where the political maneuverability becomes truly sophisticated. Abe was closely linked to numerous ultranationalist and historical revisionist groups. Crucially among them was the Nippon Kaigi, or the Japan Committee, where Abe had served as a vice secretary. This is a powerful lobby group that actively opposes what they term the masochistic view of history, or jigaku shikan. They argue that it unfairly focuses only on Japan's wartime aggressions.
And what do they advocate for instead?
The Nippon Kaigi advocates for a new constitution that promotes a beautiful, traditional national character, where citizens respect and adore the imperial household. They support creating education that cultivates a Japanese sense. Unquote. These are clearly conservative, restorative, and often quite controversial goals.
But the LDP isn't just the Nippon Kaigi. How did Abe manage to satisfy these hardline ideological demands while also maintaining the pragmatic center needed to govern and keep the U.S. alliance intact?
By focusing on functional change over formal change, Abe's strategy was to implement the goals of the revisionists, reasserting national pride, allowing for military action, redefining Japan's history through administrative and legal mechanisms, things like CSD and the careful crafting of apologies. He did all this rather than pursuing the symbolic but politically lethal goal of a formal constitutional amendment.
And the slogans helped.
The slogans helped bridge that gap. Things like respect Japan and creating a beautiful country. They are intrinsically tied to this deep ideological push for historical restoration. Yet they're vague enough to appeal to moderate voters who are just seeking national confidence after decades of economic stagnation. The narrative of restoration was all about reclaiming national pride and fundamentally redefining the state's relationship with its citizens. It was about shifting away from the occupation-imposed post-war pacifist identity. The core contention was that the Constitution itself was forced upon the nation, and restoring dignity required reclaiming sovereign decision-making over security and history, a goal the hardliners supported, but which was implemented pragmatically via reinterpretation.
So if we accept that language was the essential weapon in this strategy, especially in navigating these ideological tensions, who was designing the specific policy language? Who was framing Japan's new global role?
The key figure here is Tomohiko Taniguchi. He was widely recognized as Abe's chief speechwriter and served as his special advisor. Taniguchi, who was an academic and a communication expert, was crucial in shaping both the domestic messaging and the international perception of the administration. He saw global politics through the lens of marketing and branding.
Branding Japan, what did that actually entail?
Well, Taniguchi argued that Japan needed to move beyond its traditional quiet diplomacy, the kind that led to the checkbook diplomacy humiliation in '91, and effectively brand itself in a competitive global era. He wanted to assert Japan's soft power and strategic importance. He believed political communication was a battle for public image. Crucially, he positioned the constitutional recognition of the right to CSD as a matter of urgency, not just for military capability, but specifically to strengthen the U.S. alliance, which he saw as the most vital strategic asset for Japan's future.
That's a subtle but powerful twist. CSD wasn't just about protection. It was about alliance maintenance, making Japan a reliable, value-driven partner.
Exactly. And to justify these hard security shifts internationally, a geopolitical rationale was required. Taniguchi explicitly suggested that strengthening deterrence against China could serve as a powerful, forward-looking narrative that would constrain China's growing influence. This geopolitical framing was necessary to legitimize security shifts both at home and abroad. The message was carefully calibrated. We aren't remilitarizing for aggression. We are acting proactively to stabilize the regional order against an emerging competitor, and by doing so, we're serving global peace.
And what about the most historically sensitive issue of all, the war apologies? That requires extraordinary linguistic finesse to satisfy domestic revisionists while calming international critics.
This is where Taniguchi's mastery of strategic public relations was most evident. The meticulous crafting of the 2015 Abe statement regarding war apologies was a prime example of this strategy applied to history. The statement was strategically designed to be forward-looking. It acknowledged the necessity of carrying on the spirit of remorse expressed by previous administrations, using phrases like successive cabinets have expressed feelings of deep remorse and offered heartfelt apologies.
But there's a but there.
There is. The key linguistic move was placing the apologies firmly in the past tense, stating that future generations should not be destined to apologize forever. This established that Japan had, in their view, already expressed its remorse sufficiently, thereby facilitating his broader agenda of national restoration without constant historical debate. It neutralized the history debate just enough to push forward the security debate. It was a communicative success, really demonstrating the power of shaping public image to achieve ideological goals.
So after laying this decades-long rhetorical groundwork and centralizing power, the administration needed a technical mechanism to change the law without actually touching the text of Article 9 itself. I mean, Article 9 is absolute. The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation. So how did they legally navigate that?
The process has been incremental, starting almost immediately after the occupation with the Cold War, the so-called reverse course, which led to the establishment of the Self-Defense Forces, the SDF. The SDF was created under a highly ambiguous legal status. And crucially, the Supreme Court has historically avoided ruling definitively on the constitutionality of the SDF itself. It's allowed it to exist in this state of tacit functional acceptance.
Okay, but the main legal constraint up until 2014 was this distinction between individual and collective self-defense.
Yes, can you explain that fundamental distinction for us again?
For decades, the long-standing interpretation held by the Cabinet Legislation Bureau, or CLB, that's the body responsible for constitutional interpretations for the executive, was crystal clear. Article 9 permitted the inherent right to individual self-defense. That means defending Japan directly if it were attacked. But it explicitly forbade the exercise of collective self-defense, or CSD, that's using force to defend an allied state, even if that state was protecting Japan.
So if a U.S. destroyer protecting Japan's coast was attacked by a third party, the SDF might have to legally just stand by and watch? That sounds like a massive vulnerability in the alliance.
It was a constraint that was deliberately built into the post-war system. And to overcome this, the Abe administration realized that attempting a constitutional amendment was politically infeasible. So instead, they aimed for reinterpretation through administrative fiat. They bypassed the CLB, which was seen as this conservative body protecting the old interpretation, and instead they relied on a private body, the Advisory Panel on the Rebuilding of the Legal Basis for Security, which was composed of academic experts who were favorable to the change.
This panel then essentially provided the technical, non-political justification for the constitutional reinterpretation. This is the mechanism of depoliticization in action, isn't it?
It is the perfect illustration. A politically divisive, foundational debate about national identity, war, and peace was outsourced to a hand-picked panel of experts, who then delivered a technical recommendation on how to update the interpretation to meet modern realities. This allowed the government to argue that they weren't changing the Constitution, they were merely reinterpreting its scope to suit the 21st century security environment.
And this all culminated in the highly contentious 2014 cabinet decision. This decision effectively overturned decades of constitutional consensus by administrative fiat. It argued that the state must exercise CSD, claiming it was the minimum level of self-defense necessary in accordance with Article 9, given the new security environment. They redefined the minimum required force to protect Japan to include defending allies.
The technical justification for this dramatic shift required a really compelling public narrative. This brings us back to the rhetoric of necessity. What were these gray zones, and how did they leverage those scenarios to justify CSD?
The gray zones, or gurosen, were specific hypothetical security scenarios that highlighted the limitations of the traditional Article 9 interpretation. Abe framed the constraints not just as a legal inconvenience, but as a moral failure and an existential security risk.
What were some examples?
The most compelling examples involve scenarios where Japanese personnel were working alongside allies, for instance, in peacekeeping operations, PKOs. If SDF troops were operating alongside U.S. or Australian troops and came under fire, the Allied troops would immediately defend the SDF. But under the old interpretation, the SDF could not legally fire back to defend those Allied troops, even if their survival depended on it.
Wow, that plays directly into the sense of national honor and the need to be seen as a reliable partner, correcting that 1991 humiliation. You're arguing that the current laws are forcing Japan to be morally deficient.
Precisely. The argument was that if the SDF could not even protect its friends in the field, how could Japan command respect or maintain a functioning military alliance? This narrative of a moral deficit was extremely effective.
And they used the U.S. relationship to amplify that?
Absolutely. Abe used what we could call the U.S. pressure narrative to amplify the perceived risk. He frequently employed rhetorical questions, often quoting alleged U.S. officials, suggesting that if a U.S. vessel patrolling to protect Japan were attacked and the nearby SDF did nothing due to legal restrictions, U.S. citizens' trust and volition to work together would rapidly erode. This implies the U.S. alliance, the bedrock of Japan's post-war security and economic stability, was in immediate jeopardy because of Japan's inaction.
That's a political masterstroke. You frame the security debate not as constitutional reform, but as existential alliance maintenance. But how did you make that argument personal for the average Japanese citizen who's far removed from PKO operations or U.S. naval vessels?
By focusing on protecting the vulnerable. The rhetoric often centered on these high-stakes, emotional examples of protecting Japanese nationals abroad. For example, the SDF being legally unable to protect NGO workers or Japanese citizens potentially caught in a conflict zone, like on a vessel transporting refugees back to Japan.
So they created these very vivid life or death scenarios.
Exactly. Abe stated that under the old interpretation, the SDS could not go to rescue civilians under attack, leaving them presumably to die. End quote. This existential threat justification was crucial for securitizing the policy change. Securitization frames the issue in terms of survival, a do-or-die scenario, where opposing the policy means risking the lives of Japanese nationals. By linking CSD to the fundamental state responsibility to protect its citizens, he successfully neutralized political opposition, arguing that inaction was irresponsible and morally indefensible.
It seems like they just methodically built a case. Legal constraint equals moral deficiency. Moral deficiency equals alliance risk equals an existential threat to Japanese citizens. This required not just legal change, but a complete ideological redefinition of what pacifism even meant for Japan.
That is the perfect summary. Abe successfully framed traditional passive pacifism as irresponsible isolationism, and that created the need for a new framework that aligned morality, responsibility, and security. Positive pacifism.
So with the legal constraints eroded, the administration needed a new flag to rally under. They rebranded pacifism itself, moving from the traditional concept to positive pacifism. What did that transposition entail ideologically, and why was the rebrand so essential for this new era?
The rebrand was essential because traditional pacifism, what Abe dismissed as one-country pacifism, was successfully framed as passive, introverted, and unrealistic in a highly interdependent world. If Japan wanted international respect, correcting that 1991 failure, it couldn't just stand by. So positive pacifism, or PP, is explicitly defined as a more proactive approach to achieving world peace and stability.
And this goes back to that philosophical distinction we talked about.
It does. It went back to the temperament versus will idea. Abe used language to equate minimalist pacifism with a weakness of temperament, suggesting a lack of will or an introverted nature. Conversely, PP was associated with the strength of will and responsibility. This allowed him to depoliticize opposition by making it seem like a psychological or moral failure rather than a rational political stance. It asserted that abstaining from action in an internationalizing world amounts to passivity, not true pacifism.
So what concrete responsibilities did positive pacifism impose on Japan?
PP asserts Japan must act commensurate with its economic size, as the world's third largest economy, contributing proactively to international affairs. This includes safeguarding shared universal values like liberty, democracy, and the rule of law, and ensuring the stability of key regions. And the definition of key regions is broad, from providing development aid in Africa to ensuring the security of the South China Sea.
So military action gets reframed.
Yes. SDF deployments and security policy reforms are reframed as contributions to international society for the sake of global or regional peace, prosperity and stability, or PPS. By defining SDF actions as contributions, they carry an inherent legitimacy and are often seen as mutually beneficial to Japan and the world, which minimizes scrutiny on the military aspect itself.
We've seen repeatedly that Abe's political messaging explicitly connected security and economic issues, treating them as inseparable. How did the administration construct this rhetorical merger?
Abe's communication strategy was built around 4 interconnected policy frames. These frames were constantly reinforced in political speeches, interviews, diplomatic communiques, and they strategically blurred the lines so that economic growth became contingent on security contributions and vice versa.
Okay, let's dedicate some time to truly understanding these 4 frames as they seem to define the entire communication strategy. Let's start with the domestic economic context.
The first is the national economy frame, the NE frame. This focused purely on domestic issues, specifically the stagnation that had plagued Japan since the 1990s. It portrayed the economy as a crisis that required urgent structural reform Abenomics. Abe's rhetoric often employed urgent language like do-or-die situation, shinenba. Crucially, the economic strength that Abenomics was supposed to provide was positioned as the foundation underpinning Japan's diplomacy and security. The message was, only a strong economy can pay for strong security and effective diplomacy.
So economic success is a prerequisite for diplomatic credibility, which corrects the 1991 insult. What about the immediate threat?
That's the second frame, the national security frame, or NS frame. This centered on protecting Japanese citizens and territory from present tangible threats. Specifically, DPRK missile development and sovereignty provocations, which implicitly but very clearly referred to PRC activities around the Senkaku-ryoyu Islands in the East China Sea. The recommended treatment was national security reform, specifically addressing the legal gray zones we discussed, thereby validating CSD.
Okay, now we move to the international sphere, where these frames start to overlap significantly.
Precisely. The third is the international relations and economics frame, the IRE frame. This focused on multilateral economic integration, positioning the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, as the critical pathway to Asia-Pacific growth and stability. Economic integration here wasn't just about trade, it was framed as necessary rule setting for the region, ensuring liberal democracies dominated the economic framework.
And the final piece.
Finally, the fourth is the international security frame, the IS frame. This focused on global and regional security issues far beyond Japan's immediate vicinity. Things like Middle East stability, the defense of global sea lanes, or reacting to international humanitarian crises like the use of chemical weapons in Syria. This framed Japan's role as fulfilling an international responsibility to global peace, prosperity, and stability.
So where did these 4 frames overlap to create the core, almost irresistible political message?
The synthesis is the most powerful part of the strategy. Security legislation is presented as an answer to economic problems. For example, securing the sea lanes through which Japan imports 90% of its energy becomes a military task. If those lanes are threatened, say, in the Strait of Hormuz, the SDF must be able to deploy and support allies to keep the economy safe. Without CSD, the NE frame, the economic foundation, is fundamentally unstable.
And conversely, economic strength reinforces security.
Yes. Economic integration through the TPP is presented as a crucial security measure that binds allies together through shared values and creates a system that rules by law. This makes the pursuit of economic growth and military capability inseparable. Opposition to the new security paradigm, therefore, is framed as undermining the economy, national dignity, and Japan's international obligations all at the same time.
It's clear that the TPP was far more than a trade deal for Abe's administration. It sounds like it was an economic weapon used in a geopolitical struggle. What was the TPP's true role in the geopolitical landscape, particularly concerning regional rivals?
The TPP negotiation was framed not merely as beneficial economic policy, but as a central component of U.S. and Japanese strategic interests in the Asia-Pacific. Specifically, it was designed to counter the rising influence of China.
How was the rule-setting aspect weaponized against a rising power?
The core argument was strategic exclusion. If Japan didn't join the TPP, it risked being excluded from economic prosperity. More critically, it would be excluded from setting the rules for the new regional economic order. The implication was that if Japan and the U.S. liberal, market-driven democracies did not set the rules, then China would step in and write them, potentially undermining Japan's interests for the next century. Abe explicitly presented participation in TPP as a state plan for 100 years, positioning it as a fight to establish liberal trade rules rather than just a trade deal.
And this leads directly into the U.S. alliance dimension.
It does. Joining the TPP demonstrated U.S.-Japan solidarity across military, political, and economic dimensions. It was seen as a mechanism to reinforce reliance on the U.S. to counter China's growing regional influence. By aligning economically, the U.S. and Japan positioned themselves as leaders characterized by a shared liberal political economy, further cementing the alliance as the linchpin for the region's governance.
And this strategic thinking aligned perfectly with the documented expansion of the U.S.-Japan security scope itself.
Absolutely. The geographical scope of the U.S.-Japan alliance had already expanded significantly, from the Far East in 1960 to the Asia-Pacific in 1996, and then globally in 2006. This conceptual expansion linked global issues, like the defense of sea lanes, securing energy supplies, and upholding universal values, directly to the economic structure defined by the TPP. For instance, the ability to exercise CSD, legally approved under Abe, could lead to the SDF supporting the U.S. in securing vital choke points like the Malacca Strait, which is critical to the Japanese economy and its TPP partners. The economic argument made the military decision rational.
These changes, rhetorical, legal, and economic, have had profound consequences for the East Asian security architecture. In moving toward positive pacifism, did Japan prioritize its direct alliance with the U.S. or its obligations to broader international bodies like the UN?
Abe's rhetoric, while it frequently referenced the world and international society under the umbrella of PP, clearly prioritized the Japan-U.S. alliance, that's bilateralism, over traditional international organizations like the UN or multilateralism.
Is there data to back that up?
Yes. The analysis of Abe's speeches reveals a significant disparity. References to the U.S. greatly outnumbered those to the UN. When addressing security threats or diplomatic responses, the U.S. was the predominant partner mentioned, often alongside countries that share our values, implicitly referring to G7 or NATO allies. While Abe stressed the importance of the UN, he placed greater practical importance on the U.S.-Japan treaty system as the actual mechanism for collective security.
This emphasis on restoring the alliance wasn't accidental then. It seems like a deliberate reversal of previous policy directions.
It was. It was a direct corrective against previous administrations like Haruoyama's, which had attempted to seek closer strategic partnerships with China to overcome a perceived over-reliance on the U.S. Abe's goal was to unequivocally restore the U.S. alliance as the linchpin, asserting that the U.S. was the indispensable partner for regional stability and economic prosperity. It essentially locked Japan back into the Western security framework.
And that informed their diplomacy with other nations.
Yes, this also informed the structure of Japan's expanded diplomacy. The shift towards strengthening ties with allies like Australia, India, and ASEAN was explicitly what we call strategic multilateralism. The entire structure was premised on balancing against China's growing political and economic influence. This underlying structure reflects a political realist ideology, the balance of power, which was carefully hidden beneath the more palatable veneer of neoliberal rhetoric promoting free trade and shared values.
Let's bring this back to the present reality, specifically to the highly sensitive area just off Japan's coast. With missile batteries now deployed on Yonaguni Island, just 110 kilometers from Taiwan, how does the newly authorized collective self-defense framework position Japan in a potential Taiwan Strait conflict?
The legal shift to permit CSD is the single most critical factor here. The rhetorical framing of Japan's security challenges directly relates to preparing for such high-stakes scenarios. Abe continuously asserted the urgency of reality, citing weapons development by North Korea and provocations against our country's sovereignty from the PRC. By framing the security environment in terms of increasing severity, he ensured his military readiness shifts were seen as a reactive necessity.
So CSD operationalizes Japan's role in the region.
It means the SDS is now legally prepared to support the U.S. in combat operations across the globe, including supporting U.S. assets in the Asia-Pacific region. In a Taiwan contingency, this provides the legal framework for Japan to fight alongside the U.S., a commitment that was previously blocked by Article 9's traditional interpretation.
What does supporting the U.S. actually look like under this new CSD framework in a scenario like the Taiwan Strait? Is Japan prepared for full combat operations?
It's complex, but the legislation provides a whole spectrum of support. While the SDF is unlikely to be immediately involved in direct offensive strikes, that is still viewed as politically fraught, the new laws permit extensive rear area support and logistical assistance, which are essential for U.S. operations.
Can you give us some examples of that kind of support?
Sure. This includes crucial non-combat military support. 1. Refueling and supply. SDF vessels and aircraft can now provide fuel, ammunition, and other supplies to U.S. ships and planes operating near a conflict zone, even outside Japan's immediate territorial waters. 2. Logistics and transportation. The SDF can transport U.S. troops and equipment to the front lines. 3. Communication and intelligence. Japan can legally and structurally integrate its reconnaissance, surveillance, and communication systems with the U.S., providing real-time intelligence that's essential for U.S. force protection. And 4, and this is crucial, protecting U.S. assets. If a U.S. vessel or base operating in a role integral to Japan's defense comes under attack, Japan has the right and the obligation under CSD to use force to defend that asset. Since Taiwan is geographically crucial to Japan's sea lanes and the stability of the U.S. alliance, a conflict there would almost certainly be framed as a threat to Japan's existence, triggering that CSD authority.
So Article 9's reinterpretation didn't just normalize Japan's military. It directly operationalized Japan into the geopolitical triangle of a Taiwan conflict. It provides the U.S. with the logistical depth it would need to fight a major regional war.
Exactly. Before CSD, Japan's participation was strictly constrained to the direct defense of its own territory. Now, the government has the ability to make the operational decision to engage alongside the U.S. in a conflict scenario, driven by the perceived threat to its own security and the U.S. alliance structure. The deployment of missile batteries on Yonaguni, targeting the approaches to the Taiwan Strait, is a tangible sign that these legal reinterpretations are becoming military reality.
Let's consider deterrence that doesn't involve missiles for a moment. Given the deep economic entanglement, especially between China and Japan, what role does non-military deterrence play in managing this tri-party relationship?
Non-military deterrence is a constant and powerful factor. Stability is sought through deep economic entanglement just as much as military deterrence. China is now Japan's largest trading partner. This deep integration means that the threat of non-military retaliation like economic pressure, sanctions, or disruption to vital international supply chains remains a powerful tool influencing Beijing's decision-making regarding Japan and Taiwan.
So the economic ties are a kind of leverage.
They are. Promoting dialogue relies on maintaining the mutually beneficial relationship based on common strategic interests. Japan has heavily invested in supply chain diversification, aiming to reduce its dependency on China, but the linkage remains too profound to ignore. Abe's approach seeks stability by ensuring that if a conflict were to occur, the economic consequences would be mutually disastrous. This provides a powerful non-military deterrent alongside the newly expanded military capabilities. The complexity of managing these economic vulnerabilities while simultaneously increasing military posture really defines Japan's current geopolitical tightrope walk.
So what we've seen is a powerful, decades-long political project that achieved through legal reinterpretation and discursive maneuvering what a constitutional amendment never could. By strategically linking the stability of our lifestyle, our economy, and our national honor to the need for a proactive military role, the Abe administration effectively erased the constraints of one-country pacifism.
Indeed. The systemic deconstruction of Japan's post-war identity reveals how power operates, not just through force or law, but through language and the management of public knowledge. The complexity of the globalized environment provided the perfect cover. Abe successfully constructed a narrative where opposing his policy shifts meant standing against consensus, against the alliance, against economic stability, and against the very protection of the vulnerable Japanese citizens he claimed to be serving. Ultimately, the story of modern Japanese security policy is a profound lesson in how political actors can utilize the abstract forces of globalization and ideological framing to fundamentally reshape national governance and global responsibility, transforming humiliation into a mandate for remilitarization.